Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. You can follow the show on X at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. This episode is going to be all about Sweden, and in particular, the online discussions in Sweden around vaccine hesitancy during the coronavirus pandemic. And this is an interesting subject because Sweden had such a unique response to COVID. And I'm always surprised whenever I go traveling around and talking to people. Of course, COVID comes up, and then people are very curious. How was it in Sweden during coronavirus? And yeah, to be honest, it was pretty boring, but I forget sometimes, and I think many of us living in Sweden forget that we had such a different approach. And so what then is the discourse around vaccine hesitancy in such a context? And my guest to discuss this is Dr. Mia-Marie Hammarlin. She is a senior lecturer in media and communication studies at Lund University. So she's at my department, and we happen to be sitting just across the hall from each other. And Dr. Hammarlin has a new research article in the Journal of Digital Social Research entitled COVID-19 Vaccine Hesitancy, a Mixed Methods Investigation of Matters of Life and Death. And in this analysis, Dr. Hammarlin and her team use some quantitative topic modeling to look at the online comments in a very specific Swedish online forum called Flashback Forum. I'll get to that in a second. But also following up this quantitative work with a qualitative narrative analysis to really get a sense of what is the discourse, what are the themes, what are the attitudes of Swedes when it comes to their vaccine hesitancy. And there's some very interesting historical precedents going back to the swine flu and the H1N1 vaccine that we'll get into in the episode as well. But I think what really makes this context unique is not just the context of coronavirus in Sweden, but also Flashback Forum. So Flashback is a online forum that is a very sort of old school interface. You can check it out at flashback.org, but it's a website. I don't think many non-Swedes have heard of it, but it's very, very popular within Sweden. It's like the original Reddit. And while you could probably study Swedish anti-vaccine discourses on Reddit, or really any sort of discourse happening in Sweden, Flashback is going to be one of the anonymous forums where you're really going to get the counter narrative. And so I think it's particularly noteworthy that this study is done on Flashback comments because it really gives us an insight into what the Swedes are talking about amongst themselves. So in addition to that, Dr. Hammarlin has also done some ethnographic research because she is a trained ethnographer by going up in the middle of Sweden and meeting some of these vaccine hesitant Swedes and getting a sense of more their life worlds and really what are their attitudes. And it's connected very much to Swedish perceptions of nature and health and the individual body. So as much as we talk about research in this episode, I hope you get a sense of Swedish culture as well. And I should also say that because everything was sort of local on the home turf, we were fortunate enough to get access to one of Lund University's studios. So big thanks to Martin de Grell for helping out with the sound. He runs the Humanities and Theology Faculty podcast. I'll put a link to that down in the episode description, as well as links to Dr. Hammarlin's research on COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy, both from a computational perspective, but also from an ethnographic perspective. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Mia-Marie Hammarlin. Again, she is a senior lecturer in media and communication studies at Lund University. Dr. Hammarlin, thanks so much for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So before we dive into your research on vaccine hesitancy in online forums, why don't we start out by giving the listeners a bit of a context into the Swedish case around COVID? Sweden was all over the news for not locking down and not requiring masks, but such governmental decisions don't just happen in a vacuum. So in your view, what are the key factors that may have contributed to Sweden's different approach towards tackling the pandemic?
Yeah, it's interesting because, as you say, this is something that is brought up by people that you meet outside of Sweden, in an international context. Usually we don't think of it that much when being in that particular cultural context. But we do speak about a certain cultural context that we have here in Sweden. So you could perhaps say that the politicians and the public authorities in Sweden showed their trust in people's social trust. That people would adjust to social distancing rules without having to lock down the whole society. And we did. We are well known for that, for what is called high levels of social trust, and in relation to that, high levels of social capital. For example, we have this very famous political scientist, Bo Rothstein, who has studied this a lot, the social trust between people in Sweden and in Scandinavia more broadly. So the overarching question informing this kind of research is which qualities in social relationships result in people's cooperation being based upon trust? Quite complicated to answer that question, but it's interesting to find that Scandinavia is consistently found at the top of global statistics with respect to social capital and this generalized trust among people. So a study from 2014 shows that 65% of Swedish citizens answered in the affirmative to the assertion that most people can be trusted. It's a remarkably high figure if you compare to many other countries. So in one extreme, you would find Sweden in company here with the other Nordic countries like Norway and Finland. And in the other extreme, you would find countries such as Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, and Peru, where less than 10% think that this is the case, that you can trust people in general. And what is this then? You know, this social trust. What is it? What does it make with people and societies? So it could be interpreted as a kind of societal lubricant comprising qualities that facilitate collective actions and corporations with beneficial effects then on liberal democracy and on civil morality. So, this would be the answer then, that it was possible for the public authorities and the government in Sweden to act in this way because of this societal lubricant that we can call social trust.
And it's interesting. I'm curious, and this will feed into vaccines later in terms of the role of the state in a strong healthcare system and a welfare state. But on the other hand, it's interesting that there's such a high social lubricant when, for example, the country is so big that people often don't meet, or there's also kind of a culture of kind of keeping your own space. So I guess to what extent do you think this social trust relates to the kind of state structures around healthcare versus the idea that Swedes just kind of trust random people on the street?
Yeah, it is definitely connected to the strong welfare state. And when Swedish historians have written about Sweden as this odd example, you know, when it comes to liberal democracy around the world, if you compare Sweden with other countries, you would find an interesting connection between the individual, that we have also very strong individualism in this country. And this is connected to this strong welfare state and the public authorities and the strong belief in the state, really, and the government. So we trust in the government to help us out and to support us whenever we need it. And when described like that, you know, you could see that we kind of jump over the step in the middle that would be the family, you know, the individual connected to the family. That connection has weakened in Sweden if you compare to many other countries. So you would find a direct line kind of between the individual and the state.
Which is interesting if you think about the country that went for lockdowns first was China, which has a very strong notion of the family, right? So maybe there's something there. But before we get into COVID more specifically, I think it's important to note that your original aim for this research project wasn't necessarily about COVID, right? You wrote the research proposal on vaccine hesitancy.
Believe it or not.
And exploring that in online spaces before COVID. And then, of course, COVID happened. So could you tell us a bit about your original research idea here? Why did you want to focus on digital vaccine discussions in quote unquote normal times? And how has this huge politicization around COVID vaccines fit into your project's original idea?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I must say that when I speak about this project and say these things, that we actually were funded before in 2019, before the pandemic. We knew anything about the pandemic. People hardly believe me. It's like, wow, how could you find that topic on beforehand? But the thing is that the COVID-19 pandemic did not occur in a cultural vacuum. So in 2019, WHO identified vaccine hesitancy, and that would be the reluctance or refusal to vaccinate despite the availability of vaccines, and also free vaccines, free of charge, as one of 10 urgent threats against public health. So, for example, measles has seen a 30% increase in cases globally. And not all of these cases were, of course, due to vaccine reluctance. There can be many other explanations to this, but it is a fact that some countries that were close of eliminating this disease deal with a resurgence. And this connection between the measles and the increase of measles cases and vaccination hesitancy is, we wrote in the application, connected also to a rumor that was established since some decades now. It has been circling around, and this would be the false connection between measles vaccines and autism. And it's a very complicated story. I'm not going to go into detail in that story, but it was this MD, British MD, Andrew Wakefield, who published an article in The Lancet, and that was retracted because of fraud. So he actually lost his MD title in the end, And now he has become a martyr, you could say, within the anti-vaccination movement, also within the COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy movement, which is interesting, So this question of a presumed connection between autism and the measles vaccines, it doesn't seem to stop easily, if you know what I mean. So it's very hard to correct it. It's like an emotional story that we investigate also as a rumor. So the project that I'm PI for is actually called rumor mining. So medical rumors, vaccine rumors is in the center of what we study. So recently we have studied, for example, rumors connected to mRNA vaccines. So there are a lot of mRNA rumors circling around right now.
Mm. And when we think about these kind of well-known cases, as you're mentioning, this British doctor and the connection with autism, I mean, in terms of studying that, I think we often think about doing that on global public platforms like Twitter. But the study we're going to discuss today focuses on a specific Swedish online forum called Flashback. And I think, it's one of these things that many of the listeners outside of Sweden probably have never heard of Flashback, but it's this really interesting online forum that I just checked the other day, still one of the most trafficked websites in Sweden. And, I think it's kind of crazy because it kind of has this old school look, like it sort of comes from the 1990s, 2000s, but is still super popular today. So could you introduce our non-Swedish listeners to Flashback and why you chose to study it as a site for researching COVID vaccine hesitancy?
So we chose Flashback Forum, which is a debated arena. Also in the Swedish media, you would find a lot of criticism towards Flashback Forum of the reasons that you mentioned. It's kind of a bitter, right-winged discussion that is going on there, sometimes similar to threads you would find on Reddit, for example. But it's interesting in that sense that it's so open. And as you said, it's also open for the mainstream. I mean, we have millions of people engaging themselves in these discussions, and they can be on any topic. But we knew because of this political angle of Flashback threads, that there will be a good chance for us to find criticism directed towards different COVID-19 vaccines. So we started just by locating those threads, and we would have a more open question, saying that what do people really talk about? So we wanted to be more curiosity-driven, and also maybe driven towards what we term compassionate, like a compassionate approach towards vaccination hesitancy, because this is complicated for many people. So instead of dismissing it as just a problem that we need to fix kind of or mend, we wanted to really understand what they were talking about in these threads. And you would find, for example, this very harsh tone. So it's a sentiment that is expressed in all the threads and the comments that we study that discuss the Swedish government and the public authorities and the public officials' decisions, etc., in a very harsh tone. And it's not without irony. I mean, there's a lot of humor there as well, like black humor. And what we also could see through our analysis is that people discuss things that they really care about, like, for example, freedom issues and things like that, discussing critically travel restrictions and etc.
Yeah, so sort of like a site for information and community that we generally sort of associate with these type of interest-based forums. But one thing that I think is really interesting about Flashback, that I think sets it apart from similar sites like Reddit and 4chan, is that the threads are really long in terms of their time.
Yeah.
So you could have a thread that kind of runs decades even, and that's I think a bit unique compared to, I don't know how long the life cycle of a Reddit post is, but it's generally a few days and then it's kind of archived. Whereas just to give the listeners an example, I was looking for an example of this on Flashback recently, and the movie Saw, for example, the first thread is started by someone who just says, has anyone seen the movie Saw? Back in 2004, and it's still ongoing and updated today. So they do have these like 2-decade lifespans sometimes.
I can give another example of that because I've been delving into a thread called the Big Gossip Thread about the Swedish king. It started in 2006. And it's still, filling up, with new comments.
Yeah. And so you don't see that often in other websites. And so I'm curious, of course, with COVID, there couldn't have been a COVID thread from 2015 or something, but you chose to look at 3 threads in particular. And so I'm just curious if you could give us a bit of context about like what was the kind of the starting point of these threads, or what was the general topic that the vaccine discussions sort of were discussed under?
So the reason why we chose those threads was that they were the most active threads on this particular topic. So it was an easy choice, if you know what I mean. It was easy to motivate why we chose those threads. And they were introduced in the end of 2020. So they are kind of aligned with then the introduction of different vaccinations that were offered to the Swedish population during the beginning of 2021. So this would be the reason why we chose them. And of course, we would gladly have studied a much bigger material. But in fact, this is a minority's opinions that we are studying. So in Sweden, it's the majority take the vaccinations. So 86% taking 2 doses of different vaccines against COVID-19, for example. And the surveys also show that 4% of the Swedish population is like actively refusing the vaccines. So it's not many people that do that.
Yeah, and so the probably the similar arguments will be used across different types of threads. So you look at these 3 active threads with over 11,000 posts to them, and you run some LDA topic models on the data set, and then later followed up those topic models with a qualitative narrative analysis of those discussions. So first, what did the machine pick up as the major themes that came out across the various topic models?
Yeah, it's like you say, it's like chunks of words that are interconnected with each other, like top 10 words with high probability of being a part of the topic. But we have to decide what the topics are about ourselves, so we have to interpret it ourselves. So as I mentioned before, we find this tone sentiment in the threads that we would say is a common feature for the whole material. So not a specific topic for a specific thread or anything, but it's something that we find everywhere. So here you would find swear words, for example, and you would find that people are scared and troubled, in the situation that is termed as dangerous and things. So a lot of emotions is going on in the different threads. And as I said before, you could also find the freedom issues topic. And here you would find things that were required, for example, to be able to travel, and saying that also vaccine passes is a way of coercion.
It's like a limiting of freedom.
The limiting of freedom. So vaccine passes was definitely seen as a big problem when it comes to this voluntarily part of the vaccines, that you should take it because of like a informed consent. You cannot be forced to take vaccinations. You have to consent to take them, And another very interesting topic, I think, is what we call truth seeking. So here you would find lots and lots of references to science, to scientific arguments. You would find facts, like real facts, confirmed facts, words like information, and also you would find words like conspiracy theory, and how they try out what could be considered to be conspiracy theories and what you could term as scientific facts. And it's a discussion going on what kind of sources that you can rely upon. And in another article, we term this not anti-scientific, but counter-scientific. So it's a difference there, isn't it? Being anti or being counter. So it's like using scientific facts in a way that they find worth discussing. So it's not enough, So in many vaccine hesitancy studies, you would find the importance of delivering more facts in a correct way and everything, especially from the public authorities. They should be better of doing that. But when seeing these results from our study, that would be very difficult to do that because they have this tendency to counter. The counter argument is so in the core of what they do at Flashback.
And is that because, would you say that these discussions make it seem like the people who are writing these posts are very aware of the scientific evidence? Is that what you mean by counter science? That they are reading the studies, they are looking into this?
Absolutely. But the interpretation is another matter, right? How you interpret scientific studies and what you do with them and how you align them rather with what you already believe is correct when it comes to vaccinations. And this is connected to what we call power issues. So here you would find a cluster of words addressing the state, the population, and the media and the government. And you would find also the word trust and trust in authorities, or rather distrust in authorities. And then we also delve into another topic that we call body issues or side effects. So in general, vaccination hesitancy occurs because of people are afraid of side effects of vaccination. So this is something that you would find in all literature regarding vaccinations and vaccination hesitancy. People hesitate because they are afraid of severe side effects. You would find words mentioned like injury or medicine and serious side effects and side effects in general. And you would also find references to the swine flu that happened 10 years ago, that a vaccine that was introduced at that time in 2010 called Pandemrix actually caused a very severe side effect, namely narcolepsy. And this became a quite big problem in Sweden because we were so effective in vaccinating everyone with that particular vaccine. So we had more cases of narcolepsy here than in many other parts of the world. So out of 1.5 million Swedish children who were vaccinated, approximately 500 developed narcolepsy as a direct consequence of the vaccination, Pandemrix, that was marketed by GlaxoSmithKline. And the interesting thing is that this hasn't come to an end yet. It's still happening in the Swedish society. It's still not maybe top of mind, but in relation to the new pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, 10 years later, it so happened that people in these threads that we analyze, they make connections between the COVID-19 vaccines and the Pandemrix vaccines and its consequences.
So you have this, or would you agree that it's this body issues, side effects, which is one of 5 topics, but would you say that this is kind of the central issue that issues of power and trust sort of graph onto?
Yeah, I think so. So it really, I think the discussions point to the limit, or maybe you use the word border, between the individual body and the state, really. So vaccinations are really interesting in that kind of sense, I think, that they point exactly to that, because there are many other interventions that could happen in society, but usually it's not something that you actually bring into your own body through a jab. And you do it in a protective sense. You're not ill when you take the vaccine. You actually take it not to become ill and also to protect others. So it's very interesting in that sense, I think, that it really addresses that connection between the individual body, the physical body, and the society, really.
Yeah, so taking this a bit to a meta level and thinking about limits and borders, I'd like to talk about the limits and borders of topic models, because I'm looking at the table you have here where body issues and side effects is seen as one topic alongside power issues, trust issues, freedom issues. And so what's interesting, I think, about this study is that, and something that we don't do enough of in this type of computational research, is to do a sort of follow-up, in-depth reading of what is actually going on, outside of bordered topics, but more at a contextual level of bringing everything together. And I think you identify 3 of these narrative tropes, where one is precisely, and I think probably the chief one, is about body autonomy. So can you go a little bit into the narrative analysis and particularly what you thought that the topic models might be missing by looking at these word frequencies, for example?
Yeah, the word frequencies, it is a very good entrance, I think, to doing a qualitative analysis. It helps you from not guessing what the comments 11,000 in this case, contain. So we can be pretty sure that we have like a correct starting point when going into the qualitative phase. So this is how I see it more in this particular article. So maybe I should give an example of how people speak about the body, for example. So This is part of the qualitative analysis. So generally, I'm skeptical towards everything that the state says that we have to do. When they put such an effort into convincing us that it is for our own good, then there is a hidden agenda behind it. Thanks, but no thanks. And you could also find this kind of comic or ironic and also very harsh tone that we spoke about. And it can sound like this: you idiots that don't understand that a profit-driven society never will focus on what is best for you. You need to learn basic logic. It's possible to silence the minority as long as the majority is pleased. Enjoy your vaccines. P.S. Don't forget your 300 booster doses. But it also points to other more globally spread ideas. The profit-driven society was mentioned, for example. So one argument that you would find across many studies of vaccination hesitancy is the skepticism towards the pharmaceutical industry and their money-making. So this is sometimes termed big pharma. You've probably heard it before. So you would find also an interconnection here between what people speak about in a Swedish thread online and what they have picked up, obviously, from other sources, global discussion forums, etc. So they are definitely interconnected in different ways. So what they protect here is their bodies against medical experiments. In between the lines here, I would say that they talk about illness as something natural, something that actually can be good for us, and for the body. So it's a sometimes existential approach also towards illness and diseases,
This is interesting because I think, one of the definite cultural differences between North America and the Nordic countries is just the attitude towards medicine in general. You can see it in prescription levels, but also in terms of if you have a cold, you would just go take a Tylenol cold and flu. Whereas I think more in Scandinavia, it's like, let your body ride it out. So this idea of illness as being natural, I think is an interesting one. And it makes me think, we were talking about the strong individualism in Sweden, but also this kind of history of the H1N1 and swine flu and the side effects of narcolepsy, and then also the fact that this forum is particularly a Swedish forum. I'm just curious, to what extent do you think these discussions are kind of nationally rooted, if that makes sense? Because things like big pharma, you might see those in other contexts as well. But is your sense in analyzing these discussions that there's something particularly Swedish going on here, or is it more of a indicative of the general anti-vax discourse that other studies have picked up as well.
Yeah, but just to mention another comment then, somebody's writing, I'm just amazed that somebody so blindly can trust Daddy the state and its propaganda. So this is pointing towards what we discussed before. The trust in the state and the government and the public authorities might go too far as well, that we have to be critical also towards politicians and people in power, really. So I would say that definitely is these kinds of narratives that are Swedish that come into play here. And it's a strong welfare state that we come from, with all kinds of advancements within science, etc. So we're well known for that in the world. And this is also something that is criticized, I think. So what Maya Goldenberg, a philosopher from Canada, she calls it scientized politics, that this has been something typical also in the Swedish Nordic context, the scientized politics that the posters then attack. And it could also be that they attack what Goldenberg terms the evidence-based everything. That's really interesting, I think, the evidence-based everything of society, that we think that if we just have, scientific evidence of things, we can solve all problems, that we have in society, really. So we are very science-oriented, and this is also something that they criticize, I think, So what they do is that they turn the science-based decision of taking a vaccination, which is good for you and your people, they turn it into a value-driven question. And that is something completely different, right? A value-driven question or a science-based decision, So they turn maybe the question of vaccines into a more existential question than a technocratic medical question. And this is very provocative in the Swedish context. We are very secular, but they actually turn it into if you think of existential values, could also, there maybe you would find ideas of spiritual belief or religious ideas, etc. So when speaking of the immune system, for example, in the threads, they give it some kind of spiritual angle to it. So if you just, as you said, live this natural life, and go out in the forest every day and take long walks and hang out with the people that you love, etc., you would be better off, when being attacked by a virus. So then it would be more dangerous in their view to kind of interfere with this natural spiritual immune system that we are born with and that we should take care of. And it comes across as very provocative, I would say, in a Swedish context to have these opinions and ideas. And as you know, I've also done ethnographic work within communities with people that are skeptical towards vaccinations. So I've taken part in all kinds of rituals.
Yeah, so let's get into that because, picking up on this idea of like value judgments, it's something that topic models aren't particularly good at,
no.
Right? So on the one hand, you have this jump from looking at the kind of quantitative word frequencies to a qualitative narrative analysis, or more of these, I think, really interesting juxtapositions or contrasts, particularly within this Swedish case. Just a lot of things going on, a unique online forum, a unique response to COVID, a rather unique population in many ways. So on another level, you've, as you mentioned, have been going out and doing some ethnographic research up in northern Sweden, for example. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about, first of all, what you've been doing there, and then we can follow up with how that has helped inform your research on these areas.
Yeah, for me as a trained ethnologist and a trained ethnographer, it comes as part of the job that you do these things, so it wasn't something new for me. And also speaking of digital media and social media, I found my main interviewee through social media. So I contacted her through a hashtag called roll down the sleeve. And that was like a anti-counter movement to a more official sanctioned, movement called roll up the sleeve.
Mm-hmm. So it's like a counter protest.
Counter protest, exactly, online. So I found her through that hashtag and I just contacted her and she was very positive of meeting me and seeing me. So I took the car and drove far away. Sweden is a very outstretched, country. So to reach to the middle of Sweden, I had to travel for a whole day, for 8-9 hours in the car to get there. And I think I can go to Amsterdam, from Lund during the same amount of time. So, and I only reached half of the country. And this was a person that I had never met before, but she introduced me to her friends in a small community in a beautiful landscape called Hälsingland. And it is really beautiful. I mean, you would find these winding roads and deep, dark lakes and all the ideas that you have of Sweden's nature, the romantic views, you would find it there. So on the very first day, she says to me beforehand, would it be okay if we took a sauna together? I was like, yeah, that sounds fun. And she said, this is something that we usually do. It's like a natural thing to do for us, So what happened was that I'm on the very first day meeting these women. I undressed in front of them, we were all naked. And that's a good way of starting a dialogue, I think, being naked in a sauna together, because you have to take off your Lund University coat, kind of. And at the same time, I was very clear with my research and what I did there and why I was there, and that I'm positive towards vaccination. So I was very open, with my own vaccination decisions. I think that is very important to build trust, that they know where I come from. So I quite quickly got the nickname Lund University when they spoke about me. I heard them speak about me and they said, yeah, Lund University is here. I cannot speak right now, on the phone and things, And this was not the only thing that we did together. We did all sorts of things together, but encapsulated in their vaccination hesitancy, I would say you also have to understand a part of Sweden where you could say that the welfare state has withdrawn. Where they are left by themselves to a certain point where people have to get educations to deliver babies safely in the car, for example, because of hospitals being shut down and things. And they also have problems with unemployment and sickness, long-term sickness, and also drug abuse among young people and suicide rates among older men. We would find all kinds of figures that say that this is maybe not the most blooming part of Sweden. So I would say encapsulated in their stories in this place that I call a vacci-locus, just, trying to try out new concepts. So instead of vaccination, we have this idea of the whole nation being protected through COVID-19 vaccines. This is a vacci-locus. And that works in a different way than the vaccination does, So vacci-locus, there in a vacci-locus, anything can happen, that is connected to their values and ideas. And they also fostered this spiritual way of living. It was a spiritual lifestyle, not connected to a certain religion or Christianity or anything. It was more individualized religious belief, I would say, that was very connected to ideas of the nature again. So I did all sorts of interesting things with them. For example, I was invited to a Mother Earth ritual where we were encouraged to, howl like wolves and things like that. So it was like a transcendental phase of that ritual. And I was investigating my own limitations, I think, also as a researcher.
Finding your animal spirit.
Exactly.
Which is super interesting because I think, a lot of this, especially the quantitative analysis of social media, whether it's word frequencies or even a narrative analysis of posts, we often don't get a sense of who's behind these posts in the context of their lived experience. And, one thing about Flashback in particular is that it's like Reddit, and it's mostly anonymous. And there's certain traits that may go with anonymity, like, for example, the curse words that you find may be more likely to go up. But I'm curious, after spending some time in the sauna and at the wolf rituals with these Swedes up in the middle of Sweden, I mean, how has that informed or changed your perspective in studying online comments? Like, what have you learned by going and really meeting with these people and sort of immersing yourself in their environments? How has that affected your approach to studying vaccine hesitancy more generally?
Yeah, I really believe in the traditional way of doing what is called digital ethnography. That can be quite hard to grasp the whole individual, if you so like, or the group, only by studying online comments. You need also to meet them offline, to get the whole picture, or not the whole picture, but a better picture, at least. So, for example, when studying the threads at Flashback, I struggle with it. I think the tone is quite upsetting many times, and it's not a nice job to do. It's a dirty work, something you have to do as a researcher. I don't think it's very fun to do it, really, systematizing a study of these kinds of comments. But meeting people in their vacillocus, in their environment, is something completely different. This interviewee that I mentioned is a gentle, humble, kind, generous person. And we had so much fun together, exploring things together. And she was my comfort, kind of, when I was there. I'm not used to going to Mother Earth rituals led by a witch. I've never done it before. It was a new experience for me. And I relied on her to take me through the process, kind of. So it was like a mutual trust between her and I. I trusted in her to lead me the way through these experiences, and she did, in a very respectful way. And we are still in contact, and this is also part of being an ethnologist. It's not like you just call someone up and meet her once, because you need to keep track on each other, for a longer period of time as well. And I see things that she publishes, on social media, in her social media channels. And I see the whole picture now in another way when it comes to her vaccination hesitancy, I think. It is also very hard to diminish people or looking at them in a condescending way when having spent time with them in the way that I did, because they kind of become friends. And it's very hard to be negative in that kind of sense of being condescending to a friend, And you could say that would be unobjective or, too subjective. But this is actually central of being an ethnographer, a good ethnographer, that you become really a part of what you study. You always keep the critical distance, especially when you write about this in the end, But I also write with their eyes on what I'm writing. So I cannot be condescending in my research, and I cannot publish anything that will be perceived as condescending. I think the crucial thing is to be curious and open. It's like curiosity is so important, I think, when being a social science researcher.
Mm. And so would you say, taking this specific example, looking at we may think of it broadly as the rural-urban divide, that sort of a loser of globalization type of narrative, but also the intense sort of national consciousness around nature, which is very prominently Swedish. I mean, do you think that it's one of those things that leads to this vaccine hesitancy? Or having been and spent some time with this community, what would you say are the reasons that they are vaccine hesitant?
There are very personal reasons. It could be sometimes experiences of illnesses and things. It could also be that you bring this up with, for example, someone working at a health center, a doctor, or a nurse, that you say that you are skeptical towards vaccines, or you hesitate, when it comes to taking vaccinations yourself or giving them to your children. And then you are not met, in a respectful way, but in a condescending way, in a very critical way that you're not a responsible parent, whatever. And this is usually not a good way of dealing with these kinds of ideas. There is research on this, that nurses, for example, they should use something called motivational interviewing. That would be confirming the research that you have done. yourself and saying that I'm quite impressed by the job that you have done.
And you're a great Googler.
You're a great Googler, and but it's this is probably a very bad, thing to say, what you just said. So to these people, so I think it's very important to understand that they are really afraid. And the problematic thing with the vaccinations is that they are not 100% safe. We have vaccine-caused diseases and illnesses. They do exist, So we have these narcolepsy cases, for example, from 2010 that we have to deal with. So it's like there are memories collective memory formation, I call it, when it comes to the narcolepsy discussion in the threats connected to COVID-19. We have a tendency to not forget these very important matters, So to take their worries seriously, I think that is very important. Because they are also worried about the diseases or illnesses that the vaccines protect us from, if you know what I mean. So not giving a measles vaccine to your child is difficult. It's not an easy choice. It's a problem, that they have to deal with. So it's not an easy thing to do. It's not something that they do without thinking thoroughly.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to really get a sense of this through the interface and looking at things through text and internet slang and all of these factors that contribute to what is now a very popular research area. But I hope that the listeners kind of take away from this a sense of compassion towards researching these discourses, and also got to learn a little bit about Sweden in the process. So Dr. Hammarlin, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your research with us.
Thank you so much.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Mia-Marie Hammarlin, Senior Lecturer in Media and Communication Studies at Lund University. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I must admit that after having edited this episode, I have decided that I too will be off to the sauna. So with that, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmö. See you next time.